August the 1st, 1947. 25 minutes past 2 in the morning in the dark above the timber country near Kelso, Washington. A B-25 bomber of the United States Army is flying home to California. In the left engine, something has already gone wrong. A burned-through exhaust stack. Fire. The flame reaches the left wing and takes hold, and at about 2:30 the wing comes off and takes the tail with it. 2 men get out, the crew chief and a hitchhiking serviceman who had asked at the last minute for a ride south. Their parachutes open over the dark trees. 2 men do not get out. Captain William Davidson, Lieutenant Frank Brown, intelligence officers of the 4th Air Force, out of Hamilton Field, California. In the cargo they were carrying home, a box of metal fragments from a flying saucer case in Tacoma. A case that a wire service reporter had privately established, weeks earlier, was a fabrication. A case the 2 officers themselves, by the end of that final evening, had concluded was worthless. They died carrying slag.
This is the episode where the subject stops being a puzzle and starts having a body count. Episodes 2 and 3 were about machinery and hypotheses, offices, ciphers, things you can hold at arm's length. You can't hold Kelso at arm's length. 2 officers died at the end of a chain of decisions, and every link in that chain was a lie somebody chose to tell. Whatever Maury Island was, and we are going to argue about what it was lethal before the government ever officially cared about flying saucers at all.
2 things about that crash, stated plainly before anything else. The official cause was an engine fire. 2 crewmen survived it. There is no evidence the aircraft was sabotaged. The FBI said so in writing within 2 weeks, and this show says so now, up front, because a mythology is going to grow on this crash, and we are not going to feed it. That is documented. But hold the other fact with equal weight. The reason Davidson and Brown were on that airplane at 2 in the morning with that cargo, every step of that reason was manufactured. Deception did not need a cannon to kill them. It only needed a story. This is the Deception Thread. Episode 4. Maury Island. Rewind 6 weeks to where the story says it begins. June the 21st, 1947, and mark that date because the date is doing work. 3 days before Kenneth Arnold sees anything at Mount Rainier. 3 days before the words flying saucer exist. Harold Dahl will say he was on harbor patrol in the shallow water off Maury Island near Tacoma when strange craft appeared overhead, and one of them rained hot metal down onto his boat. The falling debris, he will say, killed his dog and injured his son. And the very next day, he will say, a man of about 40 in a dark suit found him and gave him some advice. The FBI's file preserves the warning as Dahl told it.
I know what you saw at Maury Island, and I'm telling you in a nice way to forget about it and keep your mouth shut.
That is the birth certificate of the Men in Black, the first telling of a story the culture will spend the next 80 years embroidering. And this show has to tell you immediately what it rests on. It rests on Harold Dahl saying it happened. No one else ever saw the man. Nothing corroborates it, and the tale reaches the wider world only through Kenneth Arnold's later retelling. The warning is flagged contested, and it stays flagged. As for the sighting itself, notice something. It supposedly happened on June the 21st, but no log, no newspaper, no doctor's record, no harbor report exists from June. The story leaves no trace at all until late July, after flying saucers had become the biggest running story in America, and priority over Kenneth Arnold had acquired real market value. A real event leaves contemporaneous residue. This one is backdated on its face. And the 2 men at the center of it were not quite what they said they were, starting with the job title. Harbor Patrolman. Neither man held any such position. What they ran was salvage work, chasing stray logs on the Sound. The uniform in the story was manufactured authority. Standard hoax scaffolding. Fred Crisman is the one to watch. Officially, Dahl's partner. In the FBI's own paperwork, something more precise. Dahl's, quote, superior officer. Wherever the 2 of them appear in the file, Crisman is giving the instructions, and Dahl is following them. Now the visible chain. In late June, rock samples travel by mail from Tacoma to Chicago to a man named Raymond Palmer, editor at Ziff Davis, the pulp fiction house, editor of Amazing Stories, about to launch a magazine called Fate, dedicated to exactly this material. Palmer telephones Dahl and asks, leading the witness from 1,000 miles away, whether the rocks could be from a flying disc. Both Dahl and Crisman would later tell the FBI, in so many words, that Palmer wanted them to say the rocks were disc fragments. And Palmer and Crisman were not strangers. Crisman had written letters to Amazing Stories, published in 1946 and 1947, claiming he had personally fought his way out of caves against the underground creatures of the magazine's running Shaver mystery serial. Read that again. Before Maury Island, Fred Crisman's established relationship with Ray Palmer was sending the magazine spectacular first-person fabrications and getting them printed. That is documented.
Here's the thing that makes Maury Island different from every other 1947 story, and it isn't the saucer. It's what happened when a professional checked. The Associated Press had a wireman in Tacoma named Keith Vogel. Early June, before the story's on any wire, anywhere, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer asks him to look into it. Vogel does what wiremen do. He goes to the house. And while he's sitting there, Dahl's wife walks in a rage, and orders her husband, in front of the reporter, to admit the whole thing is a fantasy he dreamed up.
Vogel reports back to Seattle, the story is a hoax. Do not print it in any form. He adds unkindly, but for the record, that Dahl struck him as, quote, a mental case. In a working press system, that is where this ends. A checked story, a failed story, a dead story. What happens instead is the reason this episode exists. The dead story starts getting pushed, and the pushing comes from 500 miles away, from one specific newspaper, The Statesman, in Boise, Idaho, Kenneth Arnold's hometown paper. Here is what Vogel told the FBI as the file records it.
Vogel stated that he had never, in his experience, had such pressure brought upon him to release a new story, and that he repeatedly advised the Boise Statesman that the story of seeing the flying discs by Dahl and Crisman was a complete fabrication.
A career wire service man telling federal agents that the worst pressure of his professional life came on the one story he had personally proven false. Stop and feel how strange that is. News cycles chase stories that might be true. Nobody organic fights that hard for a story they have been told repeatedly is a fabrication, unless the point of publishing it has nothing to do with whether it's true. Last episode, we gave that pattern a name: seeding. Getting a story into wire copy for reasons that aren't journalism. When I read the Vogel testimony, I see the signature, pressure against resistance. And I have to be honest with you that the file does not say who at the Statesman was pushing or why. The interpretation is mine, and it's flagged. But the pressure itself is not my hypothesis. It's Vogel's sworn recollection, sitting in an FBI memo. The seed existed, and someone was very, very determined to amplify it.
Hold that question. Who at a Boise newspaper needed a debunked Tacoma hoax on the national wires? Because the answer is going to circle back into this story in the strangest possible way. Because the operation, whoever's operation it was, if it was one at all, still needed one more thing. It had a story. It had a buyer in Palmer. What it needed now was a witness the whole country would believe. It needed Kenneth Arnold. Ray Palmer had been fast from the start. Arnold saw his 9 objects on June the 24th. Palmer's first letter reached him within 2 days, a pulp editor tracking saucer witnesses inside the news cycle. On July the 22nd came the second letter and an assignment. Go to Tacoma. Look into the harbor story. $200 for expenses. Arnold hesitated. He was a businessman, not a reporter, and the thing smelled odd, even from Boise. Then, on July the 25th, he gave a lunchtime talk at the Boise Ad Club and mentioned the offer. And afterward, out of a room of Idaho businessmen, a man came up to him. A man who said he happened to know both Fred Crisman and Harold Dahl, 500 miles away in Tacoma, and could vouch that they were, quote, very reliable individuals. Arnold told the FBI afterward that this encounter is what removed his hesitation. The next day he called Palmer and accepted. The $200 arrived by Western Union the following morning.
Run the numbers on that encounter, because I have. Boise, 1947, about 50,000 people. An ad club luncheon draws maybe 100, 150 from a narrow professional pool. Crisman and Dahl are not famous. They're two obscure salvage men in a city of 150,000, 500 miles away. The odds that a random Boise luncheon guest personally knows both of them, well enough to volunteer an unprompted character reference, I'd put, generously, at 1 in 10,000. And it lands in the exact window, when the target is undecided. And it removes exactly the doubt that's blocking the assignment. In the trade, that has a name, a vouching cutout. A stranger positioned to close a recruitment. Now flag it honestly. Nobody ever identified the man, and one unidentified stranger is thin evidence for anything. It's a data point, not a finding. But it is a data point, shaped exactly like tradecraft. And it goes on the board.
Two more pieces were already moving. On July the 27th, Captain Davidson and Lieutenant Brown, the two A2 officers from the cold open, were in Portland interviewing disc witnesses, the pilot Dick Rankin, Captain E.J. Smith of United Airlines, Kenneth Arnold himself. And they gave Arnold standing instructions. Report to us anything unusual regarding the flying discs. Remember those instructions. In 4 days, they will put 6 people in a hotel room. Among the men the officers had been talking to on that swing was the aviation editor of that same Boise Statesman, a reserved, watchful man named Dave Johnson, a pilot himself, a former B-29 commander from the Pacific War, still flying with the Air National Guard in 1947, and a longtime friend of Kenneth Arnold. And on July the 29th, at 5 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, Dave Johnson sent Lieutenant Frank Brown a telegram, not a press tip, a paid person-to-person Western Union wire addressed to Brown by name at 4th Air Force Headquarters, and stamped, when the Army filed it, confidential. It reads in full:
Venture Press, 305 Studio Building, 1718, Sherman Avenue, Evanston, Illinois. R.A. Palmer sent Arnold $200 to go to Tacoma to investigate flying disc report there. Suggest this out of line for present public interest in story and believe, as I suggested on your visit here, Venture Press should be checked. Dave Johnson.
Sit with what that one document establishes. A civilian newspaper man with real-time knowledge of a private wire transfer, information that was in no newspaper. A confidential channel to a military intelligence officer who had, quote, visited here. Brown had come to Boise in person earlier that month, and a civilian directing a uniformed officer's targeting. Check the publisher. Every word of that is documented. The telegram survives. What it means is a fight this episode saves for the end. Because Dave Johnson's own newspaper is the paper that had spent weeks pressuring Keith Vogel to publish the hoax. The same masthead was pushing the story into print with one hand and pointing military counterintelligence at the story's publisher with the other. That same morning, July the 29th, Kenneth Arnold did something the careful men in this story had not planned for. He got up early, told no one but his wife, filed no flight plan, and flew for Tacoma. Over La Grande, Oregon, he had, or believed he had, a second sighting, some 24 small brass-colored objects. He filmed them. The film would show nothing. And when he landed at La Grande for fuel, he telephoned exactly one human being, his friend Dave Johnson at the Statesman, to ask him not to print the sighting. Remember that call. It is the only moment in the record when anyone connected to this story knew where Kenneth Arnold was going before he got there. He reached Tacoma that evening and started phoning hotels. Full, all of them. As a last resort, in his own words, just for a lark, he tried the biggest, most prominent hotel in the city, the Winthrop. And the desk said, "Yes, Mr. Arnold, we have a room and bath for you." A reservation, standing, in his name, made in advance by someone who was not him, for a trip he had told no one about. The clerk who had taken the booking was off duty by the time he arrived, so there was no one to ask. Arnold decided some other Arnold must have booked it, and that he had fallen heir to a stranger's luck. He took the key. Room 502.
That reservation is my favorite impossible object in the whole 1947 file. Either it's the most charming coincidence of the summer, same name, same night, vanished stranger, or somebody in Tacoma got a phone call that afternoon and had 4 or 5 hours to hold a specific room in Arnold's name. And notice, the one person Arnold called mid-flight is the one man in this story with a confidential line into it from both ends. I cannot document who made that booking. Nobody ever pulled the Winthrop's 1947 reservation ledger. And believe me, I've thought about where it might be. So that connection is a hypothesis, and I'm flagging it as one. But here's what needs no hypothesis at all: the geography. The Winthrop stands at 776 Commerce Street, across the street, in the Keys Building, the United Press Office. 1 block over, on Market Street, the Tacoma Times. Everything that is about to happen by telephone happens inside a triangle of 3 buildings you could walk in 4 minutes.
July the 31st. Crisman and Dahl come to room 502 and perform the story for Arnold, who has by now summoned reinforcements of his own. Captain E.J. Smith of United Airlines, a pilot with a disc sighting of his own and a harder head than Arnold trusted himself to have. Crisman is eager to have Smith included. Dahl oddly resists. And at 11:30 that morning, before any of this is in any Tacoma paper, the telephone rings at the Tacoma Times. An anonymous man tells reporter Paul Lance that there is a meeting underway at the Winthrop in room 502 about flying disc fragments from Maury Island. Nobody in that room had called a press conference. The operation was announcing its own meeting. Arnold rattled. The fragments look like plain rock. The 2 witnesses contradict each other, and the press somehow knows his room number. Does exactly what his A2 contacts told him to do with anything unusual. He calls Hamilton Field. Davidson and Brown fly up the same day. They sit in room 502 through the evening. They listen. At one point, Brown, in confidence, shows Arnold a photograph of a strange flying wing object photographed over Phoenix, Arizona. Hold that thumbnail. It comes back in Act 3. And then, oddly early, the officers excuse themselves, collect the fragments, and drive for the airfield. Their B-25 lifts off at 2 in the morning. You already know the next 30 minutes. By late morning on August the 1st, the crash not yet a day old, the anonymous caller was back, and for the next 30 hours, he conducted the Tacoma press like an orchestra. 5 calls, 2 newsrooms. He told Lance the B-25 had been carrying the disc fragments and was sabotaged or shot down, introducing himself that time as the Winthrop's switchboard operator. Lance checked. The hotel had no male operator on duty. He called Ted Morello at United Press and named the 2 dead officers, before the Army had released their names. He knew they were A2 from Hamilton Field. He knew the cargo was, quote, top secret material. He correctly named a Colonel Gregg of A2 as a man who, quote, would not deny the shoot-down. Over the following day, he predicted that Captain Smith would be transferred to right field on Tuesday, and announced that one of the men who found the fragments was about to be flown to Alaska in an Army plane. And he invented things. A United Airlines pilot named Morgan, who had supposedly flown with Smith and been, quote, shot at over Montana. Smith knew no pilot Morgan and had never flown over Montana. Montana is where the Bozeman story from last episode had broken 3 weeks earlier. Someone was stitching the summer's stories together. by hand. And then, August the 2nd, 5:30 in the evening, after Morello confirmed to him that the story had finally gone out on the United Press wire, the caller said the 9 words this episode cannot put down.
We want this to get back to New Jersey.
We want New Jersey. Hoaxers don't debrief. A man inventing a sabotage story for attention does not call the wire service to confirm distribution, and he does not have a delivery address. That is feedback language. Someone verifying that an injection took and stating where it needed to arrive. And New Jersey, in 1947, is not a random state. Fort Monmouth, headquarters of the Army Signal Corps, the Signal Security Agency's communications infrastructure, Bell Labs, RCA. If American Signals and Communications Intelligence had a home address that summer, it was New Jersey. Now the discipline, because I promised you discipline. The FBI, which interviewed everybody, concluded that the likeliest maker of these calls was Fred Crisman himself, a hoaxer feeding his own fire.
The tidy-up was quick. Major George Sanders, the public relations officer at McCord Field, examined the fragments still in Arnold's hotel room, pronounced them slag from the local smelter, and then gathered up every last piece in the room and took it all away with him. Worthless slag, collected exhaustively. On August the 3rd, Arnold and Smith went looking for Fred Crisman. He was gone, unreachable at every number he had given them. A tipster told reporters he had been flown to Alaska in an Army aircraft. The anonymous caller had announced that flight 2 days before it happened. And when Arnold, badly shaken, 2 men dead, telephoned Ray Palmer to quit, Palmer told him to keep the $200 and offered to send more. Arnold went home to Boise, and later that month, he told the FBI what he had come to believe. The Bureau wrote it down.
Mr. Arnold stated that he personally thinks that Palmer's business is a blind for something else, and that Dahl and Crisman will do anything that Palmer asks him to, and will not talk unless Palmer tells him to.
A blind for something else. The witness at the center of the entire American saucer summer, describing, in the only vocabulary available to a Boise fire equipment salesman, a front and handled men. Within 2 weeks of the crash, the Bureau's assessment was in writing. The fragments were slag. The B-25 was, quote, definitely not carrying parts of a disc. There was, quote, no substantiation of a sabotage charge, and the story, the Bureau concluded, would not stand up. Hoax. No prosecution. File closed. All of that is documented, and none of it is wrong. And yet every strange thing in this act, the pressure on Vogel, the vouching stranger, the reservation, the caller's inside knowledge, New Jersey, is documented in the same file that says hoax. The file convicts the story and preserves the mystery in the same 20 pages. If Maury Island were the only file from that summer with fingerprints on it, you could let it go as one strange town's strange month. So before the verdict, this show drives 1,200 miles southeast to Phoenix, Arizona. Same summer, different witness. No hoaxers anywhere in the case. Watch what the government does when the witness is honest. On July the 7th, a Phoenix man named William Rhodes photographed a strange heel-shaped object over his own neighborhood. Twice. Within days, a local radio station was reporting that Army officials were studying his photographs and that the matter was, quote, top secret. Rhodes was alarmed. He had said no such thing. He was, in fact, trying to talk his own story back down. And when he pressed the station about where the language came from, they told him it had arrived as a United Press release from Washington, D.C. Note the direction of that flow, because it is upside down. The witness was shrinking his story. The nation's capital was inflating it for him, on the wires in advance of any official contact. That detail is preserved in an FBI memorandum, and this series flags it documented. Then, on August the 29th, 4 weeks after Kelso, 2 men came to Rhodes's door. One was J. Bailey Brower, a special agent of the FBI's Phoenix office. The other was George Fugate Jr., a special agent of Army counterintelligence supporting the 4th Air Force, the same 4th Air Force, carrying written orders from its intelligence chief, Colonel Donald Springer. And before the door opened, Fugate made a request that Brower found strange enough to memorialize in an official memorandum. Don't show your credentials. Don't say FBI. The Bureau's file records what the witness was told instead.
He was introduced only as a representative of the United States government. The exact official connection was not made known to Mr. Rhodes.
Anonymous federal men, identity concealed by design. And the plan for Rhodes's negatives, the physical evidence, was seizure without return. When Brower asked afterward whether the negatives would ever go back to their owner, Fugate said he doubted it very much. It was the FBI man who refused to go along. Brower told Fugate he would not accept the negatives until Rhodes was told who Fugate actually was, and told the truth, that he would likely never see his property again. The next morning, told all of it, Rhodes handed over what he had anyway. He was that cooperative. He got back nothing. 2 details from the government's own paperwork, because precision is the house style. Only 1 negative ever actually changed hands. Rhodes could not find the second, better one, so decades of lore about the seizure of the Rhodes negatives, plural, overstates the file. And the whole case was classified merely confidential, the lowest tier on a routine 3-year downgrade. Whatever this was, it was not a black vault.
Now line the 2 files up, because this is what the act is for. Dahl's man in the dark suit, the one who knew what he'd seen and told him, in a nice way, to keep his mouth shut, is uncorroborated, contested, quite possibly invented. But George Fugate is not folklore. He is in an FBI memorandum dated September the 4th, 1947, with a name, a unit, and a colonel's written orders. A federal officer concealing his identity from a civilian witness while taking custody of his evidence with no intention of returning it. And we only know because one FBI agent got uncomfortable, wrote it down, and then deliberately kept his memo away from the Air Force. The file actually says no copy is being designated for A2. Fugate's own internal report of the same interview, sanitized, reads like a routine, friendly visit. The friction survives in one agency's defensive paperwork about another. So here's the punchline of the Men in Black, and it's better than the myth. They weren't aliens, and they weren't a secret society in matching suits. The behavior, anonymous government men, confiscated evidence, keep quiet about this, was real, documented standard tradecraft. The Men in Black were a technique, and the technique didn't need Maury Island to be real, because we can watch it being used the same month on a witness nobody claims was lying.
Which leaves the verdict. And here the show does what it promised in episode 1. It argues against its own best story in the open using the method. 4 hypotheses on the board for Fred Crisman's hoax. 1. A money and publicity fabrication aimed at Palmer's pulp market. 2. A cover story, a damaged boat, a salvage racket, a mundane embarrassment that needed an excuse and then escaped. 3. A serial fabulist doing what fabulists do. 4. A directed deception operation, a witting seeding of the 1947 wave, which is the reading this series is naturally suspected of favoring. Run the evidence, and Hypothesis 4 takes 3 direct hits. Hit 1, the collapse. Dahl and Crisman folded the moment 2 actual intelligence officers sat down across from them, conceding by the end of that first evening that the fragments were ordinary slag. Directed operations carry prepared fallbacks. Theirs lasted 1 conversation with authority. Hit 2, the Bureau's disposition. The FBI treated Maury Island as nuisance fraud. No counterintelligence referral, no follow-up. Prosecution declined, file closed. Files of operations do not usually read like files of pranks. Hit 3, Crisman himself. The case that he was an intelligence asset was built mostly later, decades later, much of it by Crisman, a man whose documented hobby, ever since the Shaver letters, was inserting himself into other people's dramas, up to and including a subpoena in the Garrison investigation of 1968. So far as his verifiable record has been checked, his war service was conventional. James's own research notes one genuinely strange wartime fact. Crisman's squadron was stationed outside Kharagpur, India. At the same time, a deception planner from Joint Security Control was posted to the bomber command there. It is a real co-location. It is also exactly that, and nothing more yet, a co-location, flagged on the open list. The least contradicted reading of Fred Crisman is the boring one. A habitual fabricator with an established channel to a paying customer, monetizing 3 days of priority over Kenneth Arnold.
And I can live with that reading. That's the point of the method. You don't get to keep the story you like. You keep the one with the fewest holes. The thread does not need Crisman to be anyone's asset. A confessed hoax that killed 2 intelligence officers and invented the Men in Black is, on its own terms, everything this series is about. But the Matrix cuts both ways, and honesty means saying that too. Call Crisman a fabulist, fine. A fabulist does not explain why a Boise newspaper applied career worst pressure to publish a story it had been told was false. Nor does it explain how 500 miles away, a random person attending Kenneth Arnold's talk vouched for Crisman and Dahl at the exact moment Arnold had doubts on whether to take Ray Palmer up on his investigation offer. He does not explain a caller with inside 4th Air Force information, or a delivery address in New Jersey, or an aviation editor with a confidential wire channel to a counterintelligence officer. The hoax is solved. The amplification of the hoax is not. Whoever pushed a dead story onto the national wires that August has never been identified. That is the open case Maury Island actually leaves behind. And I'd rather leave you with a true open question than a satisfying false answer.
One more document for the road. On August the 14th, 1947, the aviation editor of the Oregonian told the FBI he had been in contact with Major General Nathan Twining, the Air Materiel Command Chief whose name will dominate our next episode, and had come away with a clear impression of what the Army Air Force's saucer investigation was actually for. The FBI recorded the impression in these words.
The Army Air Force instituted this investigation to wash out the disc reports, since they are definitely not of Army Air Force origin.
Wash out, dispose of, not find out. And yet 5 weeks later, on September the 23rd, the same General Twining signed a classified memorandum stating that the phenomenon was, quote, something real and not visionary or fictitious, and recommending a formal study. That memorandum became Project Sign, the United States government's first official office for flying saucers. Read the 2 statements together. Publicly through the press, wash it out. Privately on classified letterhead, it is real. Study it. 10 weeks, 1 general, 2 opposite postures. The public story managed down, while the internal story is managed up. Both statements are documented. What the divergence means is episode 5. The lesson of Maury Island is written at Kelso, in the timber where the wing came down. Deception is not a parlor game. A story someone plants grows consequences the planter does not control. A dead dog becomes a dead aircrew. A pulp editor's $200 assignment becomes a federal file. A man in a dark suit who probably never existed becomes 80 years of folklore. Seed, amplify, manage, harvest, and this time, bury. So one more time, who benefits? Ray Palmer got his story and a magazine empire of the unexplained. Fred Crisman got his drama. The Air Force got a hoax it could use to wash the whole subject out. And if anyone that August needed flying saucers, kept alive on the international wires. They got that too, at the price of 2 officers the record calls an engine fire. On that last one, the honest answer is still unproven and unforgotten. Next time on the Deception Thread. The saucers stop being a story and become a subject. The government's answer to the summer of 1947, to Arnold, to Roswell, to Maury Island, is to build an office to study flying saucers. Sign, then grudge, then blue book. Serious men drowning in serious reports. But an office that studies a phenomenon and an office that manages a public are two different instruments that look identical from the outside. A secret estimate, order destroyed. A courtroom in Denver where a crash saucer gospel is convicted as a con, and a CIA panel that writes the word debunk into national policy. But what was that office actually for? Episode 5, Belief Management.
Thank you for taking the time to listen. Remember, we don't teach you what to believe, we teach you how to think. This is the Circle Jerk.